Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Greetings from Washington, D.C. I'm Alan Cooperman, and I'm Director of Religion Research at the Pew Research Center. And it's my privilege today to welcome you to about a 45-minute discussion on some of our latest data about religion in public life, with a particular focus on the upcoming presidential elections. As you may know, the Pew Research Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, and non-advocacy organization, which means that we don't take sides in political matters and we don't take policy positions. Our primary funder is the Pew Charitable Trust. We don't do any commercial polling. And we study religion because we think religion is important to understand the dynamics of society in the United States and around the world. We do not promote any particular religion over other religions or religion in general over non-religion. That said, this morning, some of the data we're going to be sharing with you is not able to cover all religious groups. We will primarily be talking in some cases about Christian groups and the religiously unaffiliated. While our surveys do include all religious groups, including Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Mormons, and others, the sample sizes are sometimes not large enough to allow us to break out and talk about some of the smaller religious groups separately. We just don't have enough of them to make representative statements about them. During today's event, you're going to hear from my colleague, Greg Smith, who leads the team that conducts our domestic religion research. You'll also get to meet Claire Gesevich. She's a research associate who's done a lot of work on the pandemic's effect on religious life in America this year. And you're going to hear from Elizabeth Shupak, who's a senior researcher who recently published an in-depth report on the religious experiences of teenagers in the United States. And we're looking forward to hearing from you during our Q&A at the end. To submit your questions, please use the Q&A function. It will be enabled about 5 minutes before we begin taking questions. Feel free to drop in a question as soon as the Q&A option appears on your screen. And if you like, add your name, your affiliation, and where you're joining us from. Just a few more housekeeping items before we get started. You're muted by default, so you don't have to worry about making noise. Also, this event will be recorded and shared publicly afterward. So if you have to hop off early, you can watch later. Finally, if you are a member of the media and have additional questions, please send your inquiries to the email address from which you received the invitation for this event. Your email will go directly to our Senior Communications Manager, Anna Schiller. And with that, let me turn it over to Elizabeth Shupak, Senior Researcher on the Pew Research Center's Religion Research Team. Elizabeth, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Alan. To get started, I'm going to share a few slides. So let me pull those up for you right now. So this gets at a lot of what Alan was talking about here. In order to really understand the intersection of religion and politics, it's really important to understand what the United States looks like in terms of its religious landscape and how that landscape has changed and how it may change further. So I want to start here just first by looking at a broad picture of religion in the US. What we see here on this slide is that the share of US adults who identify as Christian has actually been shrinking over the past decade or so. Some data in this slide comes from our Religious Landscape Studies, or RLS, conducted in 2007 and 2014. So the dashed lines that you see here, these are from the RLS. And what we see there is that for Christians overall, it shows a decline of about 7 points over 7 years. This longer trend line, the solid line you see here, comes from aggregated data in each year and shows a similar picture. So between 2009 and the 2018-2019 data point at the end, you can see that the share of adults who identify as Christian went from 77% to 65%. Now, to be sure, we are still talking about a majority of US adults who say they are Christian, but there has been a steady decline. And the rest of what we're seeing here is that this decline exists amongst both Protestant and Catholic adults. But not all groups are shrinking. So adults who identify as religiously unaffiliated, that is, they say they are atheist, agnostic, or that their religion is nothing in particular, that group has been growing over the same time period. So in the RLS data, we can see that the religiously unaffiliated or religious nones, N-O-N-E-S, grew from 16% to 23%. And this longer term pattern is similar, going from 17% in 2009 to 26% more recently. Now, there's a lot going on in this chart, I know, but it does show in more detail that these subsets of religious nones are all growing as well, albeit they're starting at a somewhat smaller base. So down at the bottom here, you can see that in the longer trend line, atheists have grown from 2% of the adult population to 4%. Agnostics have grown from 3% to 5%. And this nothing in particular line, a little bit toward the middle here, you can see has gone from 12% in 2009 to 17%. And one religious group that we do talk about a lot, particularly in election years, is white evangelical Protestants. We can see here in the graphic on the left that as a share of all US adults, this group is also ticking down slightly. And at the same time, you can look at the chart on the right, which is among all white Protestants, not US adults as a whole, but among all white Protestants, those who identify as born again or evangelical is actually holding steady, if not ticking upward. And we should note just for a minute that while these trends cannot predict the future, and there's absolutely no certainty that they will continue in this way, there is a big generational component in religious identity. So as of this 2018-2019 data point, among those in the silent generation, fully 84% identify as Christian, while 10% are unaffiliated. But among millennials, those born from 1981 to 1996, it's quite a little bit of a different picture here. So 49% identify as Christian and 40% say they are religiously unaffiliated. But this all begs the question, why does it matter? Why does it matter if these groups are growing, shrinking, or even holding steady? And it matters because they each have these distinct partisan voting patterns. So here we can see that white evangelical Protestants, for example, voted heavily for Donald Trump in 2016. This data shows that 77% of white evangelicals cast their vote for Trump, while just 16% voted for Hillary Clinton. White Protestants who are not evangelical and white Catholics also favored Trump in 2016. But at the other end of the spectrum, we can see that Black Protestants, Hispanic Catholics, and those who are religiously unaffiliated largely voted for Clinton. And the partisan differences that we see here are consistent with trends from previous presidential elections. That is to say, for example, white evangelicals tend to vote for the Republican candidate, while the unaffiliated tend to vote for the Democratic one. And it's not just about candidate preference. These groups also have distinct views on how religion should or should not play a role in public life. So with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Claire Gasevich.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm going to go ahead now and start sharing my slides. Right. Here we go. So in addition to tracking, the changing religious composition of the country, one of our goals at the center, as both Alan and Elizabeth stated, is to study this intersection of religion and public life more broadly. That is to say, we're interested in these bigger picture questions about religion's role in U.S. society and what role, if any, U.S. adults think religion should play in the political sphere. So I'm going to be focusing on these bigger picture questions today, as well as some data that we from a survey that we conducted in February of this year, right before the coronavirus outbreak, that focuses on how religious groups view President Trump beyond just his approval ratings and whether or not religious groups think the current political atmosphere benefits their own religious group or not. So on the whole, in the US today, we find that the prevailing opinion of the US public is that churches and religious organizations are generally viewed as a positive good for society. For instance, about half of you or more of US adults say that churches and religious organizations do more good than harm in US society, that they strengthen morality, and they mostly bring people together. Smaller shares say that religious organizations do more harm than good, that they weaken morality in society, or that they mostly push people apart. Of course, there are sizable minorities that do say kind of that they just don't take an opinion on these questions, that churches and religious organizations don't make much difference in US society. But overall, we do see that the prevailing opinion among the public is that churches and religious organizations are seen as a force for good. So while this is clear, we also see that most US adults are pretty clear that they want religion to stay separate from US politics. So overall, 63% of US adults say that churches and other houses of worship should keep out of political matters, while 36% say they want houses of worship to express their views on social and political questions. An even larger majority of US adults say that they do not want houses of worship to explicitly endorse political candidates. About 3/4 of US adults say that houses of worship should not come out in favor of one candidate over another during political elections, while 23% say houses of worship should endorse candidates. And when it comes to the amount of influence that religious organizations currently have in politics, the public is a little bit more divided in their view. So 37% of US adults say that currently religion has too much influence in politics, while 28% say religion doesn't have enough influence in politics. And then about 1/3 of the public says that religion has about the right amount of influence in politics. So while there is consensus that religion and politics should remain separate when we're looking at the public as a whole, if we dig a little bit deeper on these questions and look at how specific religious groups think, we do see that there's a little bit of a divide in opinion. For instance, Christian groups are not united in their opinions about houses of worship staying out of politics. So 2/3 of white Protestants who do not identify as born again or evangelical, and 62% of Catholics express that they want their churches and their politics to remain separate. But among white evangelical Protestants and Black Protestants, we see a little bit of a different pattern. White evangelical Protestants actually take the opposite viewpoint on this question. Fully 6 in 10 in this group say that houses of worship should be expressing their views on day-to-day social and political questions, while a 37% minority in this group think houses of worship should explicitly keep out of political issues. Black Protestants are a little bit more divided on this question. Roughly equal shares say that religious organizations should keep out of political matters, as say that they should express their views. But these two groups, white evangelical Protestants and Black Protestants, are more likely than other religious groups to express that they want their churches and religious organizations to be expressing political opinions. And Greg will get into this a little bit more in a few minutes, but it's important to note that these two groups, white evangelicals and Black Protestants, they actually come from different sides of the political spectrum. So the majority of white evangelical Protestants identify with or lean toward the Republican Party, while most Black Protestants identify as Democrats. So we are seeing this view on kind of both sides of the political aisle. It's not coming just from groups who identify as Republicans or groups who identify as Democrats. We're seeing it on both sides. And then when we look at Jews and religiously unaffiliated adults, again, large majorities in these groups say that they want religious organizations to stay out of political matters. There's a little bit more agreement among religious groups when it comes to houses of worship explicitly endorsing political candidates. So across all the religious groups that we analyzed, larger shares express their discomfort with clergy endorsing political candidates than say religious organizations should come out in favor of a candidate. But again, on these questions, we do see that white evangelical Protestants and Black Protestants are a little bit more likely than other religious groups to say that they want their clergy to endorse candidates during an election, even though on balance, this is a minority opinion among these two groups. Now that we've discussed some of these bigger questions about the intersection between religion and politics, I do want to shift gears a little bit to discuss some data from a survey that we conducted in February of this year. And I want to issue a mild disclaimer that this survey was conducted before the pandemic, and we haven't asked most of these questions since the outbreak began. But they're still important data points to share, and they will provide a little bit of context for some of the data that Greg will be showing in a few minutes. So in this February survey, we asked a question where respondents had to assess whether their side had been winning or losing in terms of the political issues that matter to them. And this question revealed that there's a real divide among white Christians and people of other religions, specifically racial minorities who identify as Christians, such as Hispanic Catholics and Black Protestants, and also Jews and religiously unaffiliated adults. Over the past 4 years, we see that growing shares of white evangelical Protestants, white Protestants who do not identify as evangelical, and white Catholics say that their side has been winning more than losing politically. And if we look among white evangelical Protestants specifically, the share who say their side has been winning has nearly tripled since we asked this question toward the end of the Obama administration in 2016. So in May of 2016, we found that 23% of white evangelical Protestants said their side had been winning more than losing politically. But in the February survey, we found that that figure had jumped to 63%. And among white Protestants who don't identify as evangelical and white Catholics, we see an increase, although it's not as dramatic as what we're seeing among white evangelical Protestants. By comparison, Hispanic Catholics, Jews, and religiously unaffiliated adults are much more discouraged about how their side has been doing politically these days. So this question didn't specifically ask about President Trump, but we did ask some questions about Trump that track very closely with patterns that we see in this question. So we asked respondents about a number of traits that describe President Trump. And we found that white Christians are much more likely than other groups to ascribe positive traits to the president, and they're generally less likely to use negative words to describe him. For example, 45% of white Christians say that prejudiced describes Trump very or fairly well, but 7 in 10 Black Protestants, Jews, and religiously unaffiliated adults say that Trump is prejudiced. And about half of white Christians say Trump is at least fairly morally upstanding, compared with 1 or 4 or fewer among members of other groups. Furthermore, nearly 2/3 of white Christians also say that they agree with Trump on all or nearly all or many issues, but much smaller shares of these other religious groups say the same, say that they agree with Trump at that level. So with the division between white Christians and members of these other groups in mind, I'm now going to turn this over to Greg, who will discuss the current state of the presidential election.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Elizabeth. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. There we go. Yeah, so thank you everybody for joining us. We've been looking forward to this session. I'll begin to wrap up our presentation today with a look at how religious groups have rated Donald Trump's performance as president over the course of his term. I'll also take a look at longer term trends in party identification, and then lastly conclude with a look at our most recent data about how people from various religious groups say they would vote if the 2020 election were held today. Now, while it certainly seems like a lot has happened over the last 4 years, and maybe that's especially true of 2020, Donald Trump's approval ratings have actually been fairly stable across a wide variety of religious groups. Now, there is some poll-to-poll variation, to be sure, but that variation has tended to remain within a fairly narrow range. You can see here, for example, that over the course of his term in office, the share of white evangelical Protestants who approve of Trump's handling of his job as president has tended to hover between 70 and 80%. His approval rating among white evangelicals in August of this year, which is when we most recently asked the question, was 72%. That's basically identical to the 73% of white evangelical Protestants who said they approved of Trump's performance all the way back in April of 2017 during the spring of his first year as president. So not very much change there. White Protestants who are not evangelical and white Catholics certainly have not been as approving of Trump's handling of his job as president as have white evangelical Protestants. Still, between 50 and 60% of these latter two groups have also tended to say they approve of the way Donald Trump is handling his job as president. Trump's approval rating this summer stood at 53% among white Protestants who are not evangelical, and at 54% among white Catholics. And here again, we see very little change compared to the spring of 2017. At that time, 52% of people in both of those groups said they approved of the way Trump was handling his job as president. Now, compared with those three white Christian groups, all of the other religious groups that we're able to analyze in our surveys are far less approving of Donald Trump's performance as president. In our latest data, about 1 in 3 Jewish respondents say that they approve of the way Trump is handling his job as president, as do about 1 in 4 Hispanic Catholics and people who describe their religion as simply nothing in particular. Just 15% of atheists and agnostics this summer said that they approve of Donald Trump's handling of his job as president, and just 10% of Black Protestants say they think Trump is doing a good job. Now, these assessments of Trump's performance as president are very much in line with the long-term partisan predispositions of these groups. White evangelical Protestants have long been one of the most solidly and reliably Republican constituencies in the United States. And it's interesting to note that they are growing even more Republican over time. Today, 78% of white evangelical Protestants, almost 8 in 10, say that they identify with or lean toward the Republican Party. And that figure is up 20 percentage points in the last 20 years. Really remarkable change, I think. White Catholics have also been trending in a Republican direction. Today, almost 6 in 10 white Catholics, 57%, say they identify with or lean toward the Republican Party. And that number is up 14 percentage points since the year 2000. And a slim majority of white Protestants who are not evangelical also say they prefer the Republican Party to the Democratic Party in terms of their own party identification. Outside of white Christians, large and stable or large and growing majorities of those in the other religious groups we can analyze identify with or lean toward the Democratic Party. Upwards of 8 in 10 Black Protestants identify with or lean toward the Democratic Party, as do 2/3 of Hispanic Catholics and 2/3 of Jewish registered voters. And as we saw in Elizabeth's remarks, religiously unaffiliated people are growing quite rapidly as a share of the US adult population. And as they grow, they are becoming even more uniformly democratic than they were 10 or 20 years ago. Today, 2/3 of religiously unaffiliated voters, 67%, identify with or lean toward the Democratic Party. That's up from 50% who did so in the year 2000. So what does this mean for the current state of the presidential race? Heading into election season, Donald Trump's term was winding down with a fairly steady approval ratings and stable or rising identification with the Republican Party among his base of white Christian voters, white Christian supporters. In our most recent polling, however, conducted September 30th through October 6th, so just last week, we find signs of softening support for Trump among all three of the white Christian groups that we're able to analyze. Now, to be sure, Trump still leads Biden among all three of these groups. Still, the weakening of his support among these constituencies is notable. In this poll, 78% of white evangelical Protestant registered voters said they would vote for Donald Trump or lean that way if the election were held today. That's down modestly but significantly from 83% who said they would back Trump back in August. Trump now leads Biden by a 53-43 margin among white non-evangelical Protestants. In August, 59% of people in that group backed Trump. And among white Catholics, Trump's 19-point lead in August has shrunk to 8 points today. And while Trump's support among white Christians has weakened some over the last couple of months, the new data also show that Joe Biden is favored by huge margins in all of the groups we're able to analyze outside of white Christianity. Fully 9 in 10 Black Protestants say they would vote for Joe Biden if the election were held today, as do 83% of self-described atheists and agnostics. 7 in 10 Jewish voters and about the same share of Hispanic Catholics say they would vote for Joe Biden. And among registered voters who say they have no particular religion, their religion is just nothing in particular, 62% say they would cast their ballot for Biden if they had to decide today. Now, of course, we've still got 2.5 weeks or so to go before Election Day, and it's worth noting that while these data here are based on registered voters, we need to remember that the characteristics of people who actually turn out to vote, who actually cast ballots, can go a long way toward determining election outcomes. So there's a lot still to be determined. It's also worth bearing in mind that these data describe the state of the race nationally. And of course, the ultimate winner of the presidential election is determined by how things shake out in the Electoral College. And we've seen in recent years that that doesn't always line up perfectly with national popular vote results. All that said, I do hope these data can be helpful for understanding the context in which this election is taking place, and also for understanding how the dynamics of the race may be shifting, at least in some religious groups, as we head into the home stretch of the campaign. Thank you again for joining us. We're looking forward to doing our best to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Greg and Claire and Elizabeth, for walking us through the data. Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Schiller, and I help manage media relations and public outreach for the Center's Religion Research, and I will be your Q&A host today. I have enabled the Q&A function. You should see 3 dots at the bottom right corner of your screen, so if you click on that, you should be able to see the Q&A panel, and you can type in your questions, whether that's about survey methodology or about the findings or more generally. Just drop the questions right into the window. I've seen a bunch of questions already, but I'm going to take advantage of my privilege as the Q&A host, and I will ask the first question. Can you talk a little bit more about how religious groups view the president's handling of the coronavirus pandemic and what we know about that?
Yes, I can tackle that question. We last asked a question about how people think Donald Trump is handling the coronavirus outbreak specifically in early August. So keep that date in mind. A lot obviously has changed over the last couple of months. But in early August, what we saw is that the partisan divisions we see on so many other issues are evident in the way people rate Trump's handling of the outbreak. Most white evangelical Protestants, about 7 in 10 as of early August, said they think Donald Trump is doing a good job or an excellent job handling the outbreak. Among white Protestants who aren't evangelical and among white Catholics, about half said he was doing an excellent or a good job, and the other half said he was doing only fair or poor. So not as approving as white evangelicals, but still on balance, lots of people in those groups said they think Donald Trump was doing a good job. Among the other religious groups we can examine, among Black Protestants, among Hispanic Catholics, among religiously unaffiliated people, big majorities said that Donald Trump was doing only a fair job or a poor job in handling the outbreak. So the same party and religious divisions we see on so many other issues in American life carry right over into the way people think Donald Trump is handling the outbreak.
Thank you so much, Greg. I'm seeing a couple of questions coming in through the chat. It would be easier if we can have them all in the Q&A function. So I'm going to try to monitor the chat as well, but I'm going to jump to the Q&A real quick. We have a question that we get a lot, and I'm just going to throw that at you, Greg, real quick, because I know that it's a quick answer, albeit maybe disappointing. We've had an RLS 2007 and a 2014. Will there be an RLS 2021?
Yeah, great question. I certainly hope so. I don't know that it'll be RLS 2021. That would be a natural time to do it, given that there were 7 years between the first two, and that would mark 7 years since the second one. I don't know if it'll be 2021, but I do really hope that that we will do it again, and that we will do it again soon, because I think it's important to track these kinds of developments in American society, and in addition to that, personally, it's one of my favorite projects to work on. So yeah, I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we'll get to do it again soon.
And here's another question. Do you have a racial breakdown of the unaffiliated? It seems to me the asker asks that the division is largely by race, exacerbated by religious affiliation.
Oh, great question. I don't have in front of me the specifics about the racial composition of the religiously unaffiliated population. We do know that people who identify as atheist and agnostic in particular, that group is composed of a higher percentage of white people than is the case for the population as a whole. More generally, I do think it's fair to say that if you look at the Republican Party, it is increasingly, I think it's fair to say, a party that consists mostly of white Christians. White evangelical Protestants make up a big part of the Republican coalition. White Protestants who aren't evangelical, white Catholics, are all big parts of the Republican coalition. They don't make up the whole group, to be sure, but they account for a big share of it. If you look at the Democratic Party, it's very interesting. You see the Democratic Party, this is an oversimplification, but in broad strokes, we can say that the Democratic Party consists of a large group of people from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds. And those voters, on average, tend to be deeply religious. They tend to say religion is very important in their lives. They identify with a religion, mainly Christianity. Many of them say they attend religious services regularly. So in the Democratic Party, you've got a big group of racial and ethnic minority voters who tend to be deeply religious on average, combined with a large and growing group of mostly white people who, by and large, are not particularly religious. So it's an interesting dynamic at play on the Democratic side of the aisle. I hope that helps answer the question, even though I don't have the exact figures in front of me.
The next question is also one that you've gotten a lot, Greg. And Elizabeth, feel free to chime in if you want to add anything. I don't want to deprive the audience of your insights, but here's the question. One recent political science research finding is that political identity is driving religious identity more than religious identity is driving political identity. Does Pew Research Center have surveys that shed light on that?
Elizabeth, you want to tackle that one, or I can, either way. I also neither want to deprive our audience members the opportunity to hear from you, nor do I want to monopolize the conversation. So.
No, that's certainly fine. And please chime in, Greg, because I think that's a great question. And it's something that I think we would love to study a little bit more, but it is kind of not necessarily something that we have tackled quite yet in that direction and kind of figuring out which one came first, which identity came first. So I do know that there are some really interesting studies out there. I think we've read probably some of the similar ones, trying to figure out which kind of has more influence, although that is, like we said, hard to say from the data that we have. And part of what we just try to look at is kind of how these identities interact with one another. So.
Yeah, and I would just add to that I'm a big fan very recently of the work of Michelle Margolis, whose work goes a long way to demonstrating this this phenomenon by which people's political views and political surroundings, political networks can go a long way toward shaping their religious commitments. I think that there's an awful lot to that. We haven't done that kind of experimental research ourselves, but our data does show, for example, as we've seen in this presentation, a real kind of religious sorting by which religiously unaffiliated people are a strongly and increasingly democratic constituency. They're very socially liberal on average in their approach to a variety of political issues. And that's certainly consistent with what you would expect to see if politics and dissatisfaction in particular with the association, at least in the popular imagination, of religion with right-wing politics was driving some of the religious change that's underway in the United States. So yeah, I think there's a lot to that argument. One thing that I hope we'll be able to do moving forward, many of you may know that in recent years, the Pew Research Center has moved to doing more and more of our survey research in our in-house American Trends panel. This is a big panel of more than 13,000 respondents that participate in our surveys on average, let's say once a month. What that means is that we have the opportunity now to ask people about their religious identities at multiple points in time. And over time, over the long term, I hope that will mean we can actually assess how many people's religious identities change over time and whether or not and how that's connected with their political commitment. So you need to build up a pretty long longitudinal data set. You need to track people over a significant period of time, I think, to pick up on that. But I'm hopeful that we'll be able to say more about this moving forward.
And then we have a quick methodological question. Someone is interested in the sample size for, how large is the sample size, especially regarding the Jewish respondents?
Claire or Elizabeth, one of you guys want to tackle that one?
Sure, I can take a look at that. I think Claire's having a little trouble connecting here. The sample size for Jewish respondents, for most of these, it's going to change according to the survey, but there are a little over 300 Jews in the panel overall. However, again, per survey, we tend to get about maybe around 200 or so per survey. It kind of depends, as we said, on each survey that we get, although we certainly make every effort to get enough of a sample size in order to be able to talk about these groups, because we know that it is interesting to see how these different groups feel about a variety of religious and political issues, and we want to be able to speak to everybody's experience as much as we are absolutely able to.
Yeah, and just to put an even finer point on it, our general approach is that we will not report on groups in our surveys, any groups, not just religious groups, age categories, educational categories, so on. We don't report on groups in our reports unless the margin of error for that group is roughly plus or minus 10 percentage points or less. If the margin of error is larger than that, we just don't have much confidence in our ability to say much with any precision about the group in question. So that's kind of where we draw the line.
We have a ton of questions, and I'm so sorry we're not going to be able to get to all of them. They're fascinating, and please, if your question wasn't answered, feel free to email me directly. I will show my email address at the very end of this event, and you should also have it from the invite. So just send them my way, and we'll get to them. But one question that I've seen sort of in a variety of wordings is the Catholic vote. With a Catholic Democratic candidate, the Catholic vote is particularly interesting this year. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I agree. The Catholic vote is extremely interesting. One point, one thing that's important to realize, and we didn't really touch on this in the presentation today, but I've been struck by it over the years, is that the Catholic population in the United States is deeply polarized along partisan lines, just like the population as a whole. Catholics as a whole are roughly evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. And you know what? Catholic Republicans tend to look just like other Republicans in their issue attitudes. Catholic Democrats tend to look just like other Democrats in the way they approach political issues. We can see, for example, that the big majority of Catholic Republicans say they're opposed to abortion. They think abortion should be against the law in most or all cases. Most Catholic Democrats are on the other side of that issue. They say abortion should be legal in most or all cases. So when it comes to that issue, you can draw the inference that Republicans are closer in line. Catholic Republicans are closer in line with the official teachings of the church than are Catholic Democrats. That's not the case on every issue. When it comes to immigration, for example, we see that while most Catholic Democrats say they would oppose any effort to substantially expand the wall along the southern border with Mexico, the vast majority of Catholic Republicans are in favor of substantially expanding the border wall with Mexico. So Catholics are deeply divided along party lines, just as is the public as a whole. And the last thing I just mentioned is that having a Catholic candidate on the ticket, or even at the top of the ticket, is no guarantee that that one can count on the support of Catholic voters. The last time, for example, we had a Catholic at the top of a ticket was 2004, when John Kerry was the Democratic nominee. And in that year, Catholic voters broke narrowly for George W. Bush over John Kerry. So Joe Biden's Catholicism is certainly no guarantee that he can count on getting a majority of Catholic votes. Now, maybe he will. It's just not something that can be counted on necessarily in advance.
And my apologies. That was just me typing before before I muted. So sorry about the typing in the background. And apologies for using Pew Speak. Various people have asked, what is an RLS? RLS is the abbreviation that we use internally for the Religious Landscape Study. You know, as you probably know, in DC we love acronyms, and at Pew we love them even more. I have one last question, and then we're going to turn it back over to Alan to wrap things up. And I've seen a variety of questions around this. Can you talk a little bit more about how religious groups viewed the other Democratic candidates? Was Biden always the top choice?
Sure. We don't have a ton of polling we didn't do a ton of polling around the Democratic primary campaign. And thinking back to the winter of this year, the spring and winter of this year, you know, with the outbreak and everything shutting down and kind of coalescing all of a sudden, it was a unique year. But in some polling that we did in January, we did see some pretty interesting religious divisions among Democratic voters. What we saw was that Joe Biden was the preferred candidate of many Christian groups in the Democratic electorate. He didn't have a majority of support, but he was the leading candidate among many Christian groups in the Democratic primary, whereas Bernie Sanders, along with Elizabeth Warren, were the preferred candidates of the large and growing share of Democratic voters who say they are not particularly religious. So there were some interesting divisions there. Those divisions are connected to and correlated with race and ethnicity. As I mentioned earlier, we know that there are many deeply religious voters in the Democratic primary who tend to come from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds, whereas the religiously unaffiliated group in the Democratic Party tends to consist of a larger share of white people. So these things are, race and religion are very much bound up together when it comes to understanding American politics, and that's true in the Democratic primary as well.
I would just add quickly to that one of the things I found striking about that same survey is that we also asked registered voters in there if who they thought they would vote for. And now, granted, it was still early, so it was January. There hadn't been a nominee, or Biden wasn't the nominee yet, but we asked people, would you vote for Trump or would you vote for the Democratic candidate? And there are a lot of people who had already decided among these religious groups. About almost 8 in 10 Black Protestants said that they would definitely or probably vote for the Democratic candidate. About 2/3 of religiously unaffiliated voters said that they would definitely or probably vote for the Democratic candidate. So I think that that's kind of an interesting point of context there, that yes, people had their favorites. They had different views of the candidates, but they also kind of had a sense of which way they would vote anyway, almost. And a lot of that does track with the larger trends that we have seen in how religious groups vote in presidential elections.
Well, friends, I'm sorry to say we're at time. That flew right by, and we apologize that we didn't get to many of your questions. As Anna Schiller said, please feel free to email us, especially members of the media, to respond to the invitation that you got. And it'll go directly to Anna. For the rest of us, we're all accessible. I want to thank in particular Elizabeth, Claire, and Greg for doing a great job shedding light on the role of religion in politics and in next month's election. I want to point out to everybody that the data that we talked about today, and in fact, the whole corpus of the Pew Research Center's work, is available free of charge on our website at pewresearch.org, P-E-W research.org. And I want to ask everybody to have a wonderful, safe week, and come again. Thank you. Come again to our website. Come to our sessions. We really appreciate your interest in our work.